So our speakers today, we're going to start with Dr. Anna F. Peppard, who is adjunct faculty at Brock University. She's published widely on issues of representation in comics and other popular media, with a particular emphasis on representations of gender and sexuality. She's the editor of the anthology Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero from University of Texas Press last year, and writes for a number of popular comics and culture websites. She also co-hosts 2 comics podcasts, 3-Panel Contrast and Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow. Anna's paper today is titled, and I love this, I don't know, this quotation just wants to make me hear more of the whole thing. So I've worked out a detailed scheme that will force him to battle us, confronting the complex otherness of the post-war supervillain. And then our second speaker is Erika Chung, who's a PhD candidate in the Joint Communication and Culture program at X University and York University in Toronto, Canada. Her doctoral research is on how women of color experience comic books and comic book fan culture. Her research interests include Asian representation in comics, the intersectionality of race and gender, and popular culture. She's the current VP Communications English for the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics, La Société Canadienne pour l'étude de la bande dessinée. And Erika's paper today is titled, A Case Study of Superman Smashes the Klan, Confronting Racism and White Supremacy. So please join me in welcoming Anna and Erika.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I guess I'm going to go first, and I'm going to share screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that okay. Just let me know if that's not the case. And we will get started. So yes, I've worked out a detailed scheme that will force him to battle us, confronting the complex otherness of the post-war supervillain. Got a lovely Craven the Hunter there. In his influential 2006 book, Superhero, The Secret Origin of a Genre, Peter Coogan argues that just as a hero represents the virtues and values of a society or culture, a villain represents an inversion of those values. This conception of supervillains as inversions of superheroes is so accepted, it's rarely discussed. With a few notable exceptions, including Robert Moses Peasley and Robert G. Weiner's anthology, The Supervillain Reader, supervillains have received remarkably little attention within the ever-growing field of superhero studies. This neglect is surprising and unfortunate, given that much recent scholarship on the superhero genre has endeavored to challenge traditionally simplistic notions of what superheroes do or might mean. If post-war superheroes are, as recent scholars have argued, inherently queer, polymorphous, and marked by a crossing over of boundaries and the incorporation of otherness, then what exactly do inversions of such superheroes look like? When superheroes incarnate complex meanings, it stands to reason that supervillain counterparts would as well. This paper unpacks the complex opposition between the superhero and the supervillain within an era of increasingly complex superheroes, focusing on close readings of Spider-Man's lavishly illustrated battles against members of the Sinister Six in Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1 from 1964. This representative example suggests that within the post-war era, the difference in hierarchy between superheroes and supervillains is not articulated through binary opposition, but rather through different arrangements and negotiations of a shared multiplicity, some of which are more unstable and less beautiful, as well as less connotatively American and gender and sexually normative than others. In addition, while all of Spider-Man and the Sinister Six present as white, my analysis supports Sean Gines and Martin Lund's assertion in the introduction to their book, Unstable Masks, Whiteness and American Superhero Comics, that the superhero champions a master narrative of whiteness. As Gines and Lund describe, despite its Jewish roots, the superhero genre is deeply imbricated in white supremacy, offering copious fantasies of white power through the simple predominance of physically and often mentally superior white bodies. Because white supremacy upholds white as normal, it also perpetuates the invisibility of whiteness as a racial category and its attendant social and cultural privilege, which, again, presents as normal. As Richard Dyer puts it in his classic study, White, at the level of racial representation, whites are not of a certain race, they're just the human race. This paper seeks to make visible the sex, gender, and racial implications of Spider-Man's superheroism. Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1 is a memorable comic for a variety of reasons. Its plot, in which Peter Parker temporarily loses his powers for what seem to be psychological reasons, was adapted into the 2004 film Spider-Man 2. It also marks the formation of the iconic Sinister Six, a sextet of Spider-Man's most fearsome foes led by Dr. Octopus. The members of the Sinister Six have varied over the years, but the original sextet is Doc Ock, Sandman, Electro, Mysterio, Vulture, and Kraven the Hunter. These story elements, Peter's loss of power and the formation of the Sinister Six, are also thematically important. In general, and particularly in terms of understanding the evolving relationship between superheroes and supervillains in the Marvel age of comics. The Marvel Age's neurotic, emotionally damaged superheroes were part of larger cultural trends. As N. Megan Kelly writes in her book Projections of Passing, Post-War Anxieties in Hollywood Films, during the 1950s, the language of the couch altered Hollywood's representation of gender, with numerous films focusing on indicators of the internal psychological breakdown of insecure masculine identities. According to Kelly, the so-called sci guys of the 1950s, such as James Dean, Marlon Brando, and Rock Hudson, were cast as a new kind of hero. Sensitive men, often outsiders who take on feminine characteristics, including being objectified and victimized. Importantly, though, the Marvel Age superheroes still routinely triumph over their potentially debilitating neuroses. As we can see here, Spider-Man regains his powers where it matters. In contrast, the fact that supervillains keep trying to commit the same acts with the same unsuccessful results, while often becoming increasingly obsessed with the superhero, marks them as obsessive compulsive or stuck in a psychic loop. How and why superheroes are able to regroup and triumph is located as much in the plot of each story as in the composition and operation of their bodies in contrast with those of supervillains. Even when he invents a gadget to win, Spider-Man proves his superior control over his body through his body. That is, through his superior incorporation and negotiation of his biological augmentations. Owing to the oftentimes similar forms of monstrousness embodied by the superhero and the supervillain within the Marvel Age of comics, the techniques of this negotiation are rarely simple. On a very basic level, Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus, along with Spider-Man's other foes, do not clearly adhere to the division between what philosopher Mary Russo describes as the classical versus the grotesque body in Western culture. Writes Russo, "The classical body is transcendent and monumental, closed, static, self-contained, symmetrical, and sleek. It is identified with the high or official culture of the Renaissance, and later with the rationalism, individualism, and normalizing aspirations of the bourgeoisie. The grotesque body is open, protruding, irregular, secreting, full of change. It is identified with the non-official low culture or the carnivalesque and with social transformation. Spider-Man is definitely sleek and can be static in as much as his body exists within fragmented, though sequential boxes. And yet he cannot properly be described as symmetrical given his unnaturally bendable insect-like body. He is also, like Dr. Octopus, protruding, irregular, secreting, as well as multiple and changing, especially in as much as his body exists within those sequential, though fragmented, boxes. Yet differences emerge through the finer points of articulation. One of the most significant differences between Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus is the fact that Dr. Octopus's augmentation is comparatively mechanical and external, i.e. artificial, while Spider-Man's augmentation is comparatively internal and biological, i.e. natural. Although Spider-Man's bodily imitations of a spider are significantly monstrous, his body is nonetheless more human-like than spider-like. He does not, for instance, have 8 hairy legs, 3 eyes, or pincers extending from his jaw. Dr. Octopus does not integrate his mechanical augmentations as seamlessly. His augmentations sit on the outside of his otherwise human body, which often hangs limply suspended like a useless vestigial trait between his much larger and more powerful mechanical arms. Compared to Spider-Man's incorporation or negotiation of his monstrousness or multiplicity, Dr. Octopus is both unbalanced and excessive. His larger mechanical half, which extends in all directions and often fills the frame in his battles with Spider-Man, overwhelming both Spider-Man and the Doctor's own residual humanity. The comparative excess of Dr. Octopus could be read as connotatively feminine. However, there's also a phallic quality to the ways in which the often larger, harder, and longer bodies of supervillains, such as Dr. Octopus, are able to encompass Spider-Man and penetrate his face, forcing him, more often than not, into defensive or passive postures of reaction and avoidance. As Jared Gardner observes, in a survey of the first several years of Ditko's Amazing Spider-Man covers, the survey reveals that his survey reveals that vulnerability might well have been the hero's most distinguishing characteristic. The majority of Ditko's covers present the hero as prone, bound, or cowering in fear. Spider-Man's superiority is not simply a function of his possessing a more connotatively masculine body then, but rather a function of physical power combined with and articulated through flexibility and adaptability. This fact is usefully demonstrated through a set of splash pages from Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, which depict Spider-Man triumphing over members of the Sinister Six. And we will go through those now. When he battles Electro, Spider-Man's smooth, streamlined shape cuts through Electro's chaotic eruptions. Spider-Man even reclaims Electro's eruptions for himself, using their jagged outline to frame his own heroic pose. Battling Kraven the Hunter, Spider-Man once again crowns his own central, self-contained display with the supervillain's excess. While Kraven's power is partly housed in his trained leopards, Spider-Man's animalistic traits do not, at least in this image, exceed his body's clearly delineated borders. In these images, Spider-Man attacks his enemies from above and below, defying gravity both in the sky and on the ground. When he encounters Sandman's firm, solid body plants and roots itself to punch upwards against the supervillain's crushing, fluid weight. When he fights the Vulture, he hovers miraculously above him, a better flyer without the supervillain's bulky wings. He also soars above the voluminous, heavy cape and swirling smoke weighing down the duplicitous Mysterio. In these images, well, I should add the Mysterio one too, he's literally like punching through his illusion. In these images, the supervillains are literally unbalanced, ducking and stumbling under and above Spider-Man's confident attacks. Although Spider-Man's concealed face is, in other contexts, an important aspect of his monstrousness, within the context of these images of victory, it becomes a powerful symbol of control, foregrounding Spider-Man's composed objecthood against and in the mostly visible faces of the supervillains, whose eyes are wide with fear or recoiling in pain. Similarly, although Spider-Man's sleek, web-themed costume highlights his monstrousness by emphasizing his insectness, when pitted against the comparably external monstrousness of the supervillains, it functions as a vehicle and sign of containment. Spider-Man does not merely surrender to animism, he also wears it, manipulates it, designs it to literally suit his needs. His costume renders his insectness textual and totemic, foregrounding his agency and subjectivity, and thus, once again, his superior control. Ultimately, these images demonstrate that Spider-Man is better at containing but also releasing energy. In each image, energy leaves his body in directed bursts rather than chaotic, excessive explosions that typify the supervillains. At all times, then, his triumph is a function of his superior powers of negotiation, which are also his superior powers of containment. Spider-Man proves his superiority by being better at containing both himself, i.e. internal threats, and others, i.e. external threats. Importantly, this battle over who is a better negotiator is seldom a fair fight. Even Spider-Man's most sympathetic villains, such as Dr. Octopus and the Lizard, have their bodies transformed in ways that are, comparable to Spider-Man, more unstable and excessive. While Spider-Man is, from the very beginning, more human than animal, the Lizard is clearly more animal than human, just as Dr. Octopus is more mechanical than human. There is biological essentialism and, by extension, a moral absolutism at work in these comics via the suggestion that too much difference automatically makes someone evil or dangerous, and/or the suggestion that radiation, for all its instability and uncertainty, ultimately reveals goodness and badness. In the end, even the similarity between the superhero and the supervillain primarily dramatizes and emphasizes the superhero's ability to reinstate the boundaries between different types of redeemable and irredeemable monstrousness. Or, to put it far more simply, different types of redeemable and irredeemable difference. The history and consequences of these presentations are long and multifaceted. Spider-Man's superior and indeed infinite flexibility reflects the appropriative universality of whiteness. In turn, the conception of some categories of being as too visible, too physical, too bodily, too present, or simply too much, and even having bodies but not minds, has long been exploited in the social, cultural, and political disenfranchisement of women, people of color, disabled persons, and sexual minorities. As Judith Butler puts it, within hegemonic Western culture, women and slaves, children and animals must be the body, perform the bodily functions that the connotatively white, straight, able male body of reason will not perform. We can see these ideological consequences playing out more explicitly in the overtly racialized opposition between Black Panther, the Marvel's first Black superhero, and his arch nemesis, Man-Ape. On the cover of Avengers number 62 from 1969, while Black Panther is distinguished as desirable and heroic through the way he seamlessly integrates and controls his animism, Man-Ape is distinguished as undesirable and villainous through the fact that he is unbalanced, weighted down, and swallowed up by his animism. To put it simply, whereas Black Panther is attractively put together, Man-Ape quite literally has a monkey on his back. In addition, inasmuch as he is monstrously huge and muscular with exaggeratedly thick pink limbs and a flat nose, Man-Ape is a racist caricature, a Black man wearing but also resembling an ape. The use of color further confirms the racial connotations of Man-Ape's unbalanced body. Man-Ape is both half man and half ape, as well as half white and half Black. Man-Ape is thus both a racist caricature and a specter of fearful hybridity, a Black man hiding threateningly but also unconvincingly inside a white skin. Black Panther is also, of course, hybrid and, in his own way, excessive. He is, after all, a man dressed as an animal who conceals his blackness inside an even blacker animal skin. In this, the Panther is both unraced and super-raced, both racially indeterminate and racially overdetermined. Yet whereas Man-Ape evokes degeneration or miscegenation, Black Panther's seamlessness and self-containedness, which is amplified through the contrast with Man-Ape, renders him a virtual icon of purity. Man-Ape's unbalanced, excessive body serves to highlight the harsh demands that structure Black embodiment. The threat of Man-Ape suggests that Black Panther must be emphatically contained and extremely pure, not only because these qualities are hegemonically desirable in and of themselves, but also because to be anything else or anything less is to risk being dangerous, villainous, even degenerate. To be clear, I'm not arguing here that Spider-Man's battles with the Sinister Six are intentionally sexed, gendered, or racialized, at least not in the sense that we're actively encouraged to read these supervillains as sexually or gender deviant or actual representations of people of color. But to have any hope of dismantling patriarchy or white supremacy, we must recognize the way that those things hegemonic culture values as heroic, as desirable, as attractive, always relate to sexed, gendered, and racialized myths. As Gines and Lund observe, the refrain, with great power must come great responsibility, does not and cannot mean anything substantive so long as the superhero genre rests on white supremacy and white privilege. That's all I've got for you. Social media and email things if you want to check me out there, and I'm sure we'll have lots of stuff to talk about. I will stop sharing and we will get back to it.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Anna. I'm going to try to share my screen to bring up my PowerPoint. Okay, is everything okay? Can everyone see? Okay, awesome. So, okay, hi everyone. So for my presentation today, I will be talking about Superman Smashes the Klan, written by Gene Yang with art by Gyu Hiru. I will be looking at how the comic confronts racism and white supremacy through their use of race stereotypes that have historically been used to frame and stereotype Asian Americans. And so I will give just a brief overview, a little background story to where this comic comes from. So the source material is actually inspired from the 1940s Superman radio show called The Adventures of Superman. Specifically, there was a 16-episode series called The Clan of the Fiery Cross. And in that 16-episode radio series, it featured Superman confronting and fighting the KKK. And according to an essay that Gene Yang wrote as part of the graphic novel, the 16-episode series also featured a Chinese American family. However, in the radio play material, the family is not necessarily the main focus. And so he found that to be really interesting. And in writing this new graphic novel series, it was originally published as a 3-part miniseries in 2019 and culminated in the full graphic novel in 2020. But he found that to be very interesting. And as part of this, as part of Superman Smashes the Klan, not only are readers seeing a retelling of Superman's origin story, but interspersed between that is the story of, interspersed between the story is the story of the Lee family, specifically Roberta and Tommy Lee, 2 siblings who come from a Chinese immigrant family. And when we're introduced to this family, we see the family just packing up and moving from Chinatown towards Central Metropolis. And so today I would like to focus on just briefly discussing some of the history around racist stereotypes that have been used to frame and represent the Asian American community in the past, and demonstrate how Superman Smashes the Klan confronts those stereotypes, and how it draws a connection between the old stereotype of yellow peril and the more contemporary understanding of the model minority myth. So just to go back. So racist stereotypes have been used to depict and represent Asian people and communities in comic books in the as early as the early 20th century. From Yellow Peril to the Dragon Lady, these stereotypes have been used to other marginalized and limit Asian characters. It's noted that in early American comics, Asian Americans were either represented as under the scope of the Yellow Peril, or there wouldn't be much representation or inclusion at all. And so more recent superhero comic books have centered their visibility, racialized characters, their visibility as heroes with nuanced connections with family, community, and heritage. And I think we can call upon examples such as Miles Morales, Kamala Khan as Miss Marvel, and the newer iterations of Green Lantern. However, what's interesting about Superman Smashes the Klan is that neither siblings, Roberta or Tommy Lee, is taking on any kind of title as Superman or Supergirl of that nature. And so it's interesting how the superhero genre in this case, as a frame, is not so much about taking on the iconography that we associate with superheroes. So historically, the use of caricature and stereotype was a way to visually represent people of color, and specifically emphasizing those forms of differences and as ways of exclusion. The concept of having a protagonist be a person of color was once viewed fictionally and metaphorically as an error that needed to be righted by a white character. The storytelling in comic books was understood as a visual landscape that centered white narratives. And so as Leonard Riffus notes that, and I quote, examples can be found without difficulty in early American comic books that show white characters in dominant positions over non-white characters, natives or sidekicks. Cases in which a white character was dominated by a character who is not white were usually temporary inversions of the natural order of things that the story shows being put right. Racism was built into the foundation of entire once popular genres. End quote. And so I wanted to link this past history to how framing is used in Superman Smashes the Klan. So as I said, we were introduced very early on to the Lee family. And what I find very interesting about how the opening scene is presented to us is the very internal dynamics within this family and how it draws on some very specific experiences of what it's like to be part of an immigrant family. Of course, we have sibling dynamics between Tommy and Roberta Lee, but not just between siblings, but we see the entire family. The family is able to move from Chinatown, which the mention of Chinatown itself as a historical part of urban development and urban planning suggests a history of inequality and how spaces are defined even in this fictional world of Metropolis. But their father quickly tells the family that they should be using English even within their family, that their mother should be referring to the children by their English names rather than their Chinese names, and how it captures that experience of respecting and honoring your heritage, but also that pressure of assimilation. And so the concept of framing establishes a social and cultural scope regarding what people are included or excluded in social cultural reality. When whiteness is the dominant frame, social and cultural imagination, and blackness and otherness are marginalized, these frames shape how communities visualize and communicate about each other. And so I find that, the engagement and confrontation of racist stereotypes, such as the perpetual foreigner and the model minority myth, demonstrate how casual and normal white supremacy as a frame can be embedded in our cultural and social reality. As Ortega and Fegan notes, I quote, "The white racial frame includes a centuries-old pro-white subframe and an anti-black and anti-other subframes. All these other subframes are composed of racialized stereotypes, images, emotions, language accents, and inclinations to discriminate." End quote. In other words, subframes are consisted of multiple parts, including stereotypes, images, and language, in order to normalize and substantiate a dominant white racial frame. And historically, in comics in which Asian characters are depicted, they were often drawn using the rhetoric of yellow peril. This has resulted in visual stereotypes such as Fu Manchu, or even in the case of Dragon Lady. The white racial frame plays a role in establishing whiteness as the default of visual representation. By confronting racist stereotypes that stem from this dominant white racial frame, Superman Smashes the Klan forces readers to ask questions about the kind of Asian representation that is found in American comics. And so I think this scene is this page from the comic is very powerful because I am conscious of time, so I will move forward quickly. And that is, in this scene, if we take away the narration dialogue, this page can work as a silent comic. We see in the first panel, Roberta is seated in the center while her friends are seated behind her, and her peers, they either have expressions of wonderment or they have expressions of fear, and that is because they're watching a science fiction adventure action movie featuring a classic story of good versus evil. However, in this case, we see the villain of the film in the center frame panel here as a racist character, a racist character, and it's the yellow peril stereotype. And in the third panel, we see this close-up shot of Roberta having this look like she's frowning, but she also has this look of apprehension. And I think for her peers, when the dominant media representation is framed by whiteness, what you see is considered normal. But when you see yourself represented as a monster, as a demon, it's very uncomfortable. And I think in this case, because the story is focused on Roberta's narrative, readers are placed in this position of having to see that this isn't an uncomfortable experience. And so we come to this. I wish to discuss a bit about the model minority myth, and specifically how from that experience of feeling of being othered, of being framed as different and an outsider, the stereotype Yang and Gyur confronts most effectively, I think, is the model minority myth. And briefly, the model minority is a stereotype that characterizes Asian Americans as highly intelligent, hardworking, and academically inclined. However, it is also associated with negative stereotypes, such as being a threat to professional and academic opportunities, socially incompetency, and being isolating. This kind of racial stereotype might come off as complementary because it has a double-edged sword effect of having positive characters, but it still emphasizes difference on as the potential threat that persists when Asian Americans are stereotyped. And we see in this scene where the family is targeted by a hate crime by the Klan of the Fiery Cross, and their neighbors, Inspector Henderson and his friends, Black men coming to their aid, and their father responding very poorly, saying associating the Black community with crime and trouble, and wishes and tells his neighbors to please to not bother, to not aid them. However, as Yuko Kawai explains for the model minority myth, people of Asian descent become the model minority when they are depicted to do better than other racial minority groups, whereas they become the yellow peril when they are described to outdo white Americans. On the one hand, Asian Americans as the yellow peril embody foreignness and masculinity that threaten U.S. identity as a white Christian nation. On the other hand, Asian Americans who make an effort to succeed silently and diligently without demanding or protesting anything symbolize the model minority, docility or femininity, and conform to colorblind ideology. In other words, the model minority stereotype plays a role in the dominant white racial frame, specifically as part of the anti-Black subframe to undermine solidarity between racial communities. This is illustrated as such as you can see on the screen when Inspector Henderson and his friends come to help the Lee family after their home was attacked by a white supremacist group. And so not only does it touch on not only does our stereotypes used in Superman Smashes the Klan to confront the history of anti-Asian racism used in American comics, it's also delving a little bit deeper and discussing the connection between past and present in the model minority myth. And so I wanted to end on how even dialogue in this comic is used to touch on everyday casual forms of anti-Asian racism. This quote by the young lady here in the comic at the youth center, dialogue, the lettering is used specifically to it's bolded and italicized. And I think this quotation, her piece of dialogue here really kind of sums up those two, the positive characteristics and negative characteristics of the model minority myth, and how it comes up in very casual and everyday settings. And so I wanted to connect this back to representation. And Stuart Hall explains that, you know, the constructionist approach to representation is that it's, quote, "It is not the material world which conveys meaning. It is the language system or whatever system we are using to represent our concepts. It is social actors who use the conceptual systems of their culture and the linguistic and other representational systems to construct meaning, to make the world meaningful and to communicate about that world meaningfully to others." And I think that is what is so interesting about Superman Smashes the Klan, and how it uses comics and the medium and the superhero genre to change, to reevaluate and confront that that history of racist stereotyping that has been used to maintain a dominant white racial framing. But yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Erika and Anna. Those were both excellent, and I'm very glad we now have lots of time to keep talking about this, because I think, as I said, I've got a bunch of questions, but I will recede in favor of the audience, who I think have priority in this kind of thing. I see Andrew's already ready to go, so maybe Andrew, if you want to kick things off for us, that'd be great.
Thank you. Great presentations, both of you. My question is for Erika. I really liked what you were doing with the sort of multifaceted nature of the portrayal of sort of, I don't know, socialization, I guess, as a theme for defining different sort of racial, let's say, performance. But in regard to the constructionist thing, I was wondering how you viewed that in terms of this comic creating those parallels with Superman's mythology and using the language of Superman as a constructionist approach to looking at racism in America.
Yeah, when I was researching for this piece, I was reading a lot of interviews Gene Yang has done, both in promotion and like in the past, because he's written another Superman-esque series called New Superman, from when DC was doing the whole rebirth stuff. And so I think, based on what I can understand from his interviews, is that he draws very heavily on the Superman mythos of that narrative of being an immigrant, to Earth and being an immigrant to America. And I myself am a little bit conflicted on drawing those parallels, especially with how Superman as a cultural artifact has changed over time. But I think the reason why he uses Superman as a backdrop to draw these parallels is because he's the archetype of superheroes. He's like the original one. And so I think he draws these parallels in an attempt to expand kind of what the genre started from. And so I myself am kind of torn on that. But I keep finding more interviews that he's given. So I will probably continue digging into that a little bit more, because I found Superman Smashes the Klan to be interesting, because unlike the more recent superhero titles where, you know, like I said, Miles Morales or Kamala Khan, you know, Roberto Atomi in this story is not taking on a superhero mantle. You know, they still, Roberta, I guess, is inspired to pursue a career in journalism in the future. But I think that's where the ending of the comic kind of falls flat in really confronting the seriousness or the deep roots of white supremacy and how far it goes. But I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I will just note that she does wear the logo several times, but yeah.
Thanks, Erika. Elizabeth.
Can I add something to that really quickly? I was just teaching Superman Smashes the Klan last week. So a couple of the things that came up a lot in our student conversations was that some of the students, as Erika is saying, like, did find it super problematic to link Roberta's story to Superman's, in the sense that he can pass as white and other characters in the story don't have that privilege. So they saw it as kind of an appropriation of that story. But people also pointed out that, you know, you can read it as exploring what intersectionality can do productively, in terms of he's using his white privilege productively. And so you can make kind of that argument too. So I was kind of convinced by both sides of that debate, but I think there's definitely a value in saying like superheroes have always been racial metaphors. Here's the first superhero. Here's us talking about that. But yeah, I agree with you, Erika, that it's sort of complicated to link those two things in the same sense that allegory, especially when you're talking about superpowers and stuff, is always complicated because, you know, making these things sort of a one-to-one relationship between any sort of experience of real life, sort of otherness, racialization, difference can be complicated. But thank you so much for your thoughts on it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, like I was looking at Peter Coogan's definition around what is a superhero, and it is, yeah, it falls short. Not that it has to fit all three of those elements, but like when you for at least for this comic, when you add in that question of like superpowers and the privileging of powers, it's like I always say to some friends, like, I can't change how the way I look. The moment I leave the door, the moment I'm on public transit, when people look at me, I can't get away from this, no matter what my accent or lack of accent indicates, right? So yeah, thank you for that, Anna. Yeah, I'm torn on like that connection that he draws on.
Yeah, for sure. That's very fair.
Elizabeth, you got a question?
I do. You both did excellent. I just wanted to say that I loved both of the presentations. And Dr. Peppard, especially the points that you had about Black Panther and Man-Ape. I really enjoyed that aspect of your presentation. My question actually was for Erika. Just thinking about Superman Smashes the Klan and coming at it from a children's perspective. I don't know if you've thought about it at all. My son is 6.5, and he, as soon as I brought home the books, he was very, very attracted to them. And we started reading them, and he's now been reading them on his own, but we've been using them to also talk about some of these aspects. And we've been talking about them since he was, you know, maybe 3 or 4, but also, you know, I don't know if you've thought about that as well, that young children and their attraction to these books and being able to talk about race and racism with them.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Elizabeth. Yeah, I had when I was reading this, I had to constantly remind myself that this is, I believe it's part of like DC's like young adult publication stream, and so it is designed. I think the age group is meant for like young adults, like high school age students. I think that's what is included as like the age range for the book in the publication data. But I think I think that's partially why the comic still relies much on Superman's story, is to create that sense of familiarity for maybe younger readers who are more familiar with Superman and his story, and how drawing those connections offer an opportunity for people to see how this story of immigration and diaspora is not just is actually grounded in something more real and everyday. And that is, I think that's why the characters of Roberta and Tommy are in there. I think if young children are like interested in reading, this is certainly something to children can read. But I think it's always an opportunity, I think, for parents to be present or adults to be there to help engage and guide the conversation, because I think the comic does, like, I noticed like dialogue, the way the lettering was done, the way certain words were bolded or italicized, were there to emphasize like, this is not okay. You know, like, it is not okay to go up to say to someone, yeah, my grandpa thought you were all bad, but my dad thinks you're hardworking immigrants. Thanks for that. You're so brave. So like in dialogue like that, I think kind of is meant to not just like textual wise, but also visually communicate to younger readers like, this is a place to pause and think and reflect. But thank you for that question, Elizabeth. I hope that answers it.
Thanks, Erika. Ben, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks both of you for some great presentations to start the day. I also have a question for Erika, which is, I'm wondering about Superman smashes the Klan in the broader context of Yang's work for hire output, because it seems like this kind of return to early superhero comics, the kind of 30s and 40s milieu and anti-Asian racism in that context seems to be a thread that connects a lot of his work. So, I'm interested in the fact that they kept this in a 40s setting in this particular text. And then, you mentioned New Superman. There's an issue of that where Kanan Kong is sent back in time and meets Slam Bradley beating up generic Chinatown thugs or whatever. And then of course there's also the shadow hero. And so I'm curious if you have some thoughts about what is the broader project here for Yang that seems to be kind of, about this kind of constant return to the early roots of the superhero genre, and kind of this reinsertion of Asian American perspectives in that very temporally bound moment.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ben. Yeah, I've been catching up on Yang's previous published work because I've noticed what you're saying, this revisiting of the past to reevaluate and explore anti-Asian racism in the 30s and 40s within comics. I think what he's trying to do is I think it is that he's trying to bring attention to a history that has been very has been minimized and or erased. And so I think what he's trying to do is bring attention to that through his work, and I think trying to get more people to understand that, especially for Asian immigrant communities, it's not something of contemporary phenomenon, but that there have been communities of Asian descent that have been part of North American, that have been part of North America for much longer than, say, the past 40 years. And so I think what he's trying to do is bring attention to that history through his work and through his his work with DC Comics. I find it really interesting how he revisits Monkey King a lot. I have a soft spot for that myth, that folk story, that mythology, that myth. But yeah, I think I'm still in the process of catching up with his past work to make sense of how it's informing his present work. I have his, he had another book published last year, the really big one about basketball from his time as being a teacher. I still need to read that one because I feel like that one is a little bit different from what he's so far been doing. And I think maybe that is a place I need to visit in order to really tie everything or try to make sense of what he's been trying to do by revisiting the past.
Great, thanks, Erika. William.
Sorry, I was just reading the comments. Thank you both so much for your presentations. They were tremendously informative and super engaging, and it was such a privilege to be here and to be treated to them. I have a question that stems from Dr. Peppard's presentation, but Erika, please feel free to offer your insights as well. I'm particularly interested in the representation of quote unquote madness in I guess the Spider-Man mythos, as far as how we conceptualize what for villains is, as you pointed out, an obsession or a psychological drive, and it's something that is almost empowering for these villains. It's through their neurodiversity that their I guess their strength derives. Whereas for Spider-Man, any sort of intrusion of psychological distress, any self-doubt or anything like that is debilitating. And I was wondering if you had given any thought to that idea insofar as how it contributes to otherness.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because I mean, that's the complication of like these characters are sort of embodying similar things, but with different arrangements of multiplicity. I think your point about it empowering them in some ways is like important too, if we're going to reread supervillains as subversive in ways that the text like encourages us to not do sometimes. But you know, we can obviously reclaim those characters, especially if we're going to be thinking about something like, you know, like queer supervillains and how they can disrupt the narrative and that kind of thing, and that can be very powerful. But by the same token, what I see as especially problematic is sort of the biological essentialism sort of embedded in the fact that mental illness is written into the body, and it's written into the body as a foregone conclusion. And, you know, it's just something that they can't triumph over, like for a fact of their biology, which is written into their flesh in a graphic visual way. And it is hard to get past that and sort of the implications of that when you're thinking about something like those splash pages, because you can have, I mean, it matters too that these sort of arrangements of multiplicity like mean different things in different moments. Like Spider-Man can be sort of cowering, like in fear, like from Dr. Octopus and some of those other images I showed you. And yet in another image, depending on the articulation of his body and depending on the illustrated contrast between the supervillain and the superhero, and depending on what point in the story this is, like if that's the climax of the story, then like that fight is going to take on a certain significance. And I mean, especially in a splash page. But I mean, so you can have these sort of shifting power relationships, but they still kind of go to a certain climactic conclusion. And there is like a subversion of that in serialized storytelling to the extent that the superhero never really wins. They have to keep fighting the supervillain. And I think that is another way that sort of the Marvel comics complexify that relationship between superheroes and supervillains. There is no definite victory. You had that before, of course, because Joker keeps coming back and whatever, but like you have that more foregrounded in the Marvel comics. But I could go on, but those are some thoughts on it anyway. Maybe that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Anna. Looks like we've got time for one more question if anyone wants to throw one out. Or there's also, I don't know if we want to bring the conversation from the chat back into mouths instead here, because like I was Ben the comment you brought up there, Ben, about the safety of putting these conversations into the past, right? Of kind of bracketing them off as a historical event as opposed to something that's going on in the present is really interesting, I think. I wonder maybe, Erika, you want to address that for a second. I'm finally now using my chair's privilege to bring it to you, but to think about kind of walking that fine line between kind of showing the roots of the superhero in the midst of white supremacy and the risk of saying that was then, you know what I mean? Like those are things that were going on then, and giving us a kind of an 80-year buffer zone between the events and kind of today.
Can I tack something onto that real quick? Is that we've had that 4 times now with the adaptations of female superheroes. Peggy Carter, Captain Marvel, 2 Wonder Woman movies, all set in the past.
Yeah.
Just interesting. They don't want to sort of talk about feminism in the present.
Like I've read, like I said, I've read some of Jean Yang's other superhero comics. Like New Superman is probably the most obvious example of like how another obvious example of how he engages with the past in order to comment on in order to like not just reclaim the history, but I feel like the underlining theme is we confronting the past, but like wanting to present the future as hopeful, as like going forward things will be better, but that's kind of a misstep in ignoring contemporary, like current forms of inequality and racism and white supremacy that persists. The past informs the present. So I feel like maybe for creators, the fact that they're creating right now, they feel like by engaging the past and publishing or creating right now is a form of I don't know, I don't really want to describe it as progress, but I feel like it's their attempt at, it's like, oh, it's already one step to engage with the past and reflect on the past and engage and question it, but it may not be as productive as they think or hope it is. That's kind of my feeling, and that's why I feel like, at least with Gene Yang's work, like he still publishes outside of, you know, the IP comics, right, outside of Marvel and DC, and I think I've been a little bit behind on reading that material, and so I want to continue reading his other stuff in order to see, does this train continue, because whenever, like in interviews when I've watched online, he struggles to answer that question too. I feel like when people ask, like, what about now? Yeah, I think the ending of Superman Smashes the Klan probably sums up that hurdle of what do we do about now? Because superhero comics are kind of aspirational, right? It's always about hope and maybe the future will be better. But in order to get to the future, we have to kind of tackle the now and the present.
Well, I mean, if I can add something to that really quickly, I mean, I do think one of the reasons that, and I love Gene Luen Yang's work, like absolutely love his work. I love Shadow Hero dearly, and for my money, it's better than Superman Smashes the Klan. But anyway, but I think that part of its popularity stems from like him being a reconstructionist as well as a deconstructionist, and sort of making it okay to like superheroes through his deconstructions and reconstructions, which isn't a bad thing. I love superheroes. I mean, I love the power of superheroes. I mean, I got Nightcrawler reaching out his hand behind me, but like by the same token, like a useful contrast might be something like Truth, Red, White, and Black, which deconstructs but doesn't reconstruct. And there's problems with that text in terms of Black agency, funnily enough, that people have criticized, but at the same time you can see an uncomfortable narrative there where it's like it's impossible for this Black superhero to exist because the superhero genre is so white supremacist. Culturally, historically, narratively, this wouldn't be allowed to exist, and so it doesn't create space for a Black superhero. And I think that challenge to what the genre is really interesting, but at the same time that means we don't get Black superheroes. So it's sort of like it's a push and pull of like what we're going to do. I mean, those are just two examples, right? There's so many more examples of ways that people have negotiated that, but I still find Truth, Red, White, and Black an interesting text in terms of how uncomfortable it makes us, in terms of the fact that it doesn't create space and can't find a way to create space. And yeah, I don't know, just an interesting comparison maybe.
Yeah, no, I'm like, as a last note from me, like what I find most interesting about, you know, the deconstruction and reconstruction is trying to, I think there is inevitably a sense of uncomfortableness. I think like even when Yang explores the past, it's uncomfortable. The fact that Metropolis has a Chinatown is a big red flag. I'm like, what are you saying? Like, you're saying you literally, the history of Chinatowns are horrifying. And so I'm like, the fact that there is a Chinatown in this fictional world, I think says that like there's no way you can ignore it. But I think what they're trying to do is that wrestling of navigating and negotiating. And I don't think there is like going to ever be like a clean cut, satisfying answer. But I think, yeah, what he is doing is at least giving an audience the chance to see the what ifs, and maybe that is what we have right now, which is not to say it's okay. It's just what we have right now.
Yeah, and also exposing the histories that have always been there, right? Because I mean, that's a central part of both resurrecting sort of the racial, ethnic meanings bound up in Superman, but also linking that to like talking about histories that aren't taught often enough, right? And talking about those underexplored linkages between sort of anti-Asian violence and anti-Black violence too.
Okay, we're a little bit over time. I think that was an excellent way to wrap things up. Thank you both one more time for your excellent papers, and thank everybody for the conversation that came afterwards. I think this is really a wonderful way to start the day. So please join me once again in thanking Anna and Erika, and we will see you at another panel later.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.